So let me give you an example. This example comes from my study, Male Pre-Service Teachers and Discouragement from Teaching, which was published in the Journal of Men's Studies in 2011. First, I'll start by giving you the abstract, which will give you a sense of the entire paper and what I was after. After that, I'm going to read the conceptual framework, and that'll give you a sense of the entirety of it, which I'll then talk about in terms of how it relates to the rest of the research design. So here's the abstract.
Driven largely by concerns over boys' education, countries worldwide have seen crisis discourses over small numbers of male teachers, particularly those teaching young children. Despite public desires and policy movements to increase their numbers, important barriers and challenges remain for male teachers. Pre-service teachers' experiences, especially, might illuminate challenges to the recruitment and retention of males. Using a pro-feminist, social interactionist framework and qualitative discourse analysis methods, this study examines discouragements from peers, family, and teacher education as faced by 3 male student teachers. These included gendered teasing about the ease of and cuteness required in education coursework, gendered objections to wasting their ability, and gendered suspicions of sexual predation. The analysis focuses on strategic performances the men use to cope with discouragements and persist in teaching. I argue that foregrounding such performances can disrupt barriers for males and thus increase their numbers.
Now you'll see within this abstract that the conceptual framework is pretty apparent. It may not be obvious right now, but you'll see in just a moment after I read the conceptual framework to you that keywords like pro-feminist, social interactionist framework, and qualitative discourse analysis methods are embedded in the conceptual framework for the study. So here's the conceptual framework.
In this article, I use a critical pro-feminist lens. To abstract this large body of work, pro-feminist theory, the parenthetical pro indicating the complicated relationship of men as allies of feminists, starts from the standpoint that girls, women, and femininity are systematically oppressed or marginalized in most educational contexts. Yet gender and education scholars have increasingly recognized that some boys, men, and masculinities are also marginalized in education, particularly those males who are feminine, of color, disabled, poor, not heterosexual, intellectual rather than athletic, and more. Pro-feminist theorizing, though, treats with skepticism claims to crises, or a war against boys and men, prevalent in popular educational discourses. Such discursive moves are seen as predicated on what has been called recuperative masculinity politics, aimed at re-establishing men's dominance over women, commonly termed a backlash against women. Worldwide efforts to recruit more male teachers, for instance, sometimes invoke problematic discourses that only men can teach boys well, and that males must serve as role models, particularly for boys of color. By using a pro-feminist perspective, I can explore the gender-based barriers for males entering teaching while remembering that in many ways discouragements male teachers face are not necessarily signs of oppression. Rather, from another perspective, these discouragements can be seen as the costs of privilege in other domains for some men. Suggestions that men not enter teaching because of low pay, for instance, is predicated on a recognition of the financial privileges that men can obtain in other careers. I also take a symbolic interactionist stance toward gender, where people do gender as a continuous accomplishment. Gender is performative and discursive, such that individuals partly create their genders in interaction with others. There are, of course, limits to the explanatory power of performance and discourse, for structure clearly circumscribes the agency that individuals have in their enactment of gender, and material, social, and political consequences follow any gender choices made. One means of excavating power and resistance to it, the latter being key to understanding males' ability to persist in teaching, is using Butler's theory of performativity, looking for the contradictions inherent in performance to identify ways gender constrains student teachers in their choices. Butler proposes that gender is a performance, constituting the identity it is purported to be. Rather than gender being determined by essential biology, individuals construct their identities for others by the things they do. As Butler explains, quote, "Gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a rigid regulatory frame, which congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance, of a natural kind of being." Close quote. In other words, gender must be repeatedly reaffirmed with stylizations, appearance, gestures, speech, actions, that are delimited by cultural norms and expectations, Butler's rigid regulatory frame. By performing stylizations, individuals show the audience the naturalness of the regulation, and thus his or her masculinity or femininity. If successful, the result is the audience's relaxing of or withholding of enforcement. Figure 1 shows this process graphically. Using this performativity framework, in this article I examine experiences of discouragement, or regulatory frames, that 3 male student teachers faced in becoming teachers, telling others about their career plans, and navigating their teacher education programs. I particularly look to the types of discouragement faced and the performative and discursive ways these pre-service teachers resisted or coped with discouragements, thereby forestalling many negative effects. I conclude that, as the men encountered discouragements, they constructed identities, often by asserting masculinity, that could resist dissuasion. By so doing, the teachers unmasked the socially constructed, performative, power-laden nature of gender. They also indirectly point out for teacher educators and policymakers opportunities to encourage and support the entry of more males into classroom teaching.
That's pure poetry, isn't it? Well, if we were to summarize my conceptual framework's argument, and Ravitch and Riggin make a really good claim for why a conceptual framework makes an argument, we can summarize it this way into 4 main arguments. The first paragraph, girls and women are oppressed or marginalized in education, and so are some boys and men. Second, some of the barriers for men are the costs of privilege in other areas. That's the second paragraph. Also, third, gender can best be understood through a symbolic interactionist lens, particularly Butler's notion of gender performativity. And that's the majority of the conceptual framework, paragraphs 3 and 4, as well as figure 1. And 4, male pre-service teachers face discouragements of many types and at various times and locations. They use gendered identity moves to cope. So you can see that there should be a kind of logical flow to a conceptual framework, making an argument for why you look at any particular phenomenon from that point of view. Now, if we go back to what we were thinking of earlier in terms of the 3 essential elements, you'll note that all of those elements were there in varying degrees. Personal interest was not as much of a part, at least explicitly, as it might sometimes be in some of my studies. Now, of course, the notion that girls and women face oppression in educational institutions does come from my own personal set of beliefs and the way that I look at educational institutions when I research them. I'm less explicit about my personal interest than some might be in, say, a participatory action research project, but nevertheless, that is one of the elements that's in there. For topical research, I do have some topical notions in there, including worldwide debates over men and boys in education. But the biggest part comes from my theoretical framework, 2 paragraphs plus a figure that try to outline that theoretical framework for readers. So you can see that even though I have all of the essential elements represented, they are represented in varying degrees. Now, in a different article, even if I were to rewrite this particular article for a different location, I might adjust those elements and foreground certain elements more in one location than I might in this particular location.